The German Panzerwerfer 42 refers to a half-tracked multiple rocket launchers employed by Nazi Germany during the Second World War. It first went into production in April of 1943, and was produced until March of 1945. The rocket launcher was on a chassis referred to as Maltier, which means mule. Opel was the main manufacturer, producing most of the components, including the 3.6-liter, 6-cylinder engine, which had 68 horsepower and an 80-liter fuel capacity. Throughout the 3 years it was produced, 300 Panzerwerfers and 289 of its variant, the Munitionenkraftwagen, were made. The Munitionenkraftwagen was the exact same vehicle, just without the rocket launcher. It was mainly used for ammo resupply. The Panzerwerfer had a 150mm, 10-barrel rocket launcher, which traversed 270 degrees, could be elevated up to 80 degrees, and was guided with an optical sight. It had a crew of 3, a commander, who was also the driver, a radio operator, and a gunner. Throughout the years in production, there were changes in armoring and suspension, along with small changes in the shape and thickness of the steel armor, resulting in 3 specific variants of the vehicle. The Panzerwerfer 42 was used for larger-scale rocket barrages against Soviet positions where a large bombardment of a big area would be more effective than more accurate artillery fire. The Panzerwerfer's rocket barrages covered much larger areas and added more psychological elements to the fight. The amount of noise, smoke, splinters, and flying debris as the rockets hit and exploded was considerable. The German engineers designed this system because of the conspicuous trails of smoke left behind by the Nebelwerfer batteries, which necessitated a self-propelled artillery piece for quick relocation after firing. The system contained 10 missile tubes, and generally carried 20 projectiles, enough for the vehicle to fire 2 full salvos. The effective range for a Panzerwerfer's rockets was about 4,000 to 6,500 meters, and the maximum range was less than 7,000. The Panzerwerfer saw action on both fronts, seeing its first combat in Russia in late 1943. As to whether it saw action at Kursk, there is not enough solid information to support that, but it is very possible. There is some evidence that some early launcher prototypes were field-tested in battles near Kursk, but that is based only on a few written accounts, and there are no photos that show the vehicle there in combat. The extensive use on the Eastern Front showed that this weapon could be employed effectively on the Western Front as well. When the Western Allies first went into action against this weapon after D-Day, they too would learn about the effects of the multiple rocket launcher. American intelligence before D-Day pointed to the use of rocket launchers such as the Nebelwerfer by the German army, but besides that, they were overly unprepared for the effects of a mobile, armored, camouflaged, and highly destructive rocket launcher mounted on a half-track chassis. The British and Canadians were the first of the Western Allies to see the German rocket launchers in action against troop concentrations and Allied positions. The 7th Launcher Brigade was sent to Normandy after D-Day, and on June 10 it was in Falaise. The next day, the unit was about 10 kilometers from Caen. The unit was part of the attack on the Orne Bridge, which was a British-held position over the Orne River. The 84th Regiment of the brigade, which was made up of the 83rd and 84th Regiments, had 14 combat-ready Panzerwerfers, and the 83rd had about the same. The British were usually at the receiving end of the Panzerwerfer rockets in Normandy, but the 15-cm Nebelwerfers were used in large numbers against American, British, and Canadian troops throughout the summer of 1944. The Battle of the Bulge was the proverbial stomping ground of German armored rocket launchers during World War II. The most concentrated, massed salvos were used in the Ardennes during the weeks of the German offensive. Some of the few pictures that exist of the Panzerwerfer in action were taken during late 1944 and early 1945 in the Ardennes region of Belgium. Rocket launchers saw extensive use during April and May of 1945, as the Russians were quickly advancing on Berlin. Panzerwerfers were used in large numbers defending positions inside of Germany and close to Berlin as the Russians advanced from the east and the Americans from the west. The majority of these vehicles met their end at the hands of the approaching Russian army. Many films of the battles in Berlin were taken in the last weeks of March and into the first weeks of April 1945, and there are many taken at night showing the firing of multiple rocket barrages. Many of the films are of the Russian Katyusha truck-mounted rocket launchers rockets, but many show the Panzerwerfer rockets too. The Panzerwerfer was a dangerous and destructive weapon, but it had many disadvantages that were obvious once you looked past the power of the weapon it was equipped with. The weight of the vehicle was its main disadvantage, as the chassis, armored body, rocket launcher, ammo, and an extra salvo of ammo brought the weight above 7 tons. Its speed on the road was about 40 km per hour, and off-road its top speed was only about 20 km per hour on reasonable terrain. The suspension, wheels, and tracks were simple and didn't require much maintenance. Due to the weight of the vehicle, the climbing and fording ability was minimal. Its ground clearance was only about a foot, which made traversing tough terrain much more of a challenge than if it was a fully tracked vehicle. This was its advantage in operating on the Russian steppes, as the naturally flat terrain of Russia was to the vehicle's advantage. Creeks and streams less than 2 feet deep were the most that could be crossed. The rockets the launcher used had only one disadvantage, which was range. The maximum range was less than 7,000. In Normandy, it was an example of the ineffectiveness of a massed bombardment weapon. A large portion of the salvos fired at troop concentrations missed their mark by hundreds or thousands of feet. The metal rocket casings were thin, which created a large amount of shrapnel on impact, but due to the thin metal used, the shrapnel effect was not as deadly as it was intended to be. The weapon caused more chaos than mass casualties. Combat tactics usually called for a group of 3 to 6 vehicles to mass fire on a specified position, but on many occasions crews operated from different locations but within the same firing range to reach a predetermined target. Very few Panzerwerfers that were captured by the Allies were captured in any quantity. Photographs of the vehicles taken German propaganda photographers generally showed groups of vehicles at staging areas, usually loading the launchers with rockets in preparation for an attack.